I was recently watching The Aviator, the movie adaptation of the life of Howard Hughes. The movie is centered around Hughes' eccentricities and mental illness, but in the background is the story of the battle between Pan American World, or Pan Am, and Trans World Airlines, or TWA. These two companies were household names at the time and were in fierce competition to try and gain an edge over each other. At their respective heights, they both saw revenues over $1 billion. They helped develop many of the standards of the commercial airline business that are still around today. So let's see how both of these companies became major players in the airline business to eventually going out of business.
For the 718th time, we present Camaro versus Mustang.
Many of us rely on them to get around, and I always wonder, you probably do too, which one is better?
It's just one offensive in its battle with rival Pepsi for hearts and taste buds.
Let's first dive into Pan American World, or just Pan American back then. Pan Am was first started in 1927 by two Air Corps majors. They started by flying mail for the United States Post Office to major cities. The first flight was out of Key West, Florida to Havana, Cuba. This was the first official scheduled international flight. This was great publicity for Pan Am and put them at the forefront of the American aviation. After some mergers and acquisitions, Juan Trippe became the head of the company. He immediately started scouting for air routes in the Caribbean. This was because Pan Am's fleet and a majority of planes then were seaplanes. Since their fleet consisted of a majority of flying boats, pilots were issued nautical captain's uniforms. This trend stuck and is the reason why plane captains still wear nautical uniforms to this day. The company continued to expand and grow, with new aircrafts that they called the Clipper Fleet. These planes were huge seaplanes that offered routes as far as South America. To accommodate all these new planes, they built a marina airport out of Miami. It soon became the busiest marina airport in the world. Pan Am continued to rack up firsts for aviation. In 1930, they were the first to fly across the Pacific to China, and in 1941, they made the first flight around the world. These aviation feats further solidified Pan Am as the go-to company for international air travel. Some of their other innovations included land-to-air navigation, long-range weather services, more effective aircraft engines, and airport-to-plane traffic control systems. These innovations are still used today and set the groundwork for modern air travel. As the years went on, they continued expanding and innovating in the aviation industry. By the 1950s, Pan Am had routes flying all over the world, so they officially changed their name to Pan America to Pan America World. Now let's see how TWA got its start and how it compares to Pan Am. TWA got its start 3 years after Pan Am in 1930. TWA was created from the merging of a few different companies. This included the Transcontinental Air Transport and Western Air Express. They combined the two names and came up with Transcontinental and Western Air, or TWA. Charles Lindbergh and Jack Fry were the heads of the company and were very experienced in the airline business. Just like Pan Am, TWA got its start by flying mail for the post office. Unlike Pan Am though, TWA focused on smaller domestic land flights. These flights would carry both mail and passengers. As they expanded though, they focused on passenger travel. They wanted to make the experience of flying as seamless and comfortable as possible. They expanded their fleet with the new DC-3s and eventually Lockheed's L-749s. By 1946, TWA had a great hold on domestic passenger travel. As time went on though, Charles Lindbergh and Jack Fry had a falling out, and the company changed hands many times. People didn't know what the future of TWA was going to look like, since it couldn't find stable ownership. This is where Howard Hughes stepped in and agreed to buy a majority of the company, but only if Jack Fry left. They agreed, and Howard Hughes, who was already wealthy from a successful tool company, was now the majority stakeholder of TWA. Since Pan Am and TWA were the only American carriers to Europe at the time, TWA survived the uncertainty, and with newfound ownership, they could start looking towards the future. In 1950, with Hughes' eye on Pan Am, TWA started setting its sights on global travel, and officially changed their name to Trans World Airlines. Pan Am and TWA had similar starts by flying mail for the United States Post Office and expanding their routes and commercial services as they grew. At first, Pan Am was more focused on international flights while TWA was focusing on domestic routes. This gave them both room to grow and expand in those prospective areas without much competition. Soon, though, they both started expanding into each other's markets, which began a direct competition. This fierce rivalry between the two pushed American and the American airline industry into a new golden age of commercial flight. As the 1950s continued to see the rise of the jet-powered planes, Pan Am and TWA split their adaptation of this new technology. With the development of Boeing's first commercial jetliner, the 707, Pan Am decided to purchase 20 of these new planes. However, with the sometimes short-sighted Howard Hughes at the helm, TWA opted to stick with the conventional prop engine planes. As jet-powered engines continued to prove more effective and faster, Howard Hughes decided to order over 70 new jet engine planes. This order was around $500 million at the time, but Howard Hughes had an idea. He was going to use money from his tool company to buy these planes to keep TWA's margins low, since his tool company was going through their own financial issues. This left TWA unable to pay for these new planes, and forced them to go to Wall Street investors for a bailout. After the Wall Street bailout, Charles Tillinghast was appointed the new head of TWA, and Howard Hughes was pushed out of the company. During this time, Pan Am was gaining more market share in international travel. They developed the first economic-only aircraft, which flew from New York to London. In 1958, while TWA was still uncertain about their financial future, Pan Am officially flew the first Boeing 707, which was the first American commercial jetliner. After this, Pan Am saw an explosion in growth and signed a $150 million lease for the new corporate office in Midtown Manhattan. This iconic building had Pan Am's name in huge letters and showed that they were truly on top of the airline industry. With Pan Am and other airlines already flying the Boeing 707, TWA looked to get back its market share. With Howard Hughes out of the company, they expanded their reach outside the US and sponsored the TWA Moonliner in Disney World. This sponsorship made people believe that TWA was the future of air and eventually space travel. They also continued to innovate and glamorize the flying experience. TWA was the first to show a full feature film while flying. They also focused on making sure their stewardesses were at the top of their game. Stewardesses were becoming a sort of pseudo-celebrity in the airline industry. So much so that young women at the time strived to become airline stewardesses. TWA began to change its logistical network as well, and developed the first hub-and-spoke model for routes. This model consisted of having a permanent facility acting as the base of operations, or the hub. TWA's main hub was in Kansas City, but also had an East Coast hub which was ahead of its time. They would then have routes fly out of the hubs, creating the spokes. This model decreased the amount of empty seats per flight and made more direct flights available for passengers. Many airlines today still use the hub-and-spoke model to coordinate their flight routes. TWA began expanding outside the airline industry. They bought up the international division of the Hilton Hotels and other food and real estate corporations. This was not only done to catch up to Pan Am, but also showed that TWA was not just an airline, but it was the forefront of the travel industry. As the first supersonic planes were being developed, TWA and Pan Am were very interested in adding commercial supersonic jets to their fleet. British Airways was flying the Concorde in their fleet, which was the first commercial supersonic jet. The Concorde flew over 18,000 feet and could achieve Mach 2 or around 1,300 miles per hour. A flight from New York to London would take a little over 3 hours. Pan Am ordered 15 Boeing 2707 supersonic jets, which were still in development, while TWA ordered 8 British Airways Concordes. Unfortunately, they both never got these orders, because the use of supersonic jets were banned. The main reason was because of the loud sonic boom the planes would make when they were breaking the sound barrier. The sonic boom was so loud that it would sometimes break windows in nearby cities. Since supersonic jets were cancelled, Boeing started development of the new wide-body 747, specifically with the help of Pan Am. On January 22, 1970, the first twin-deck 747 took flight with Pan Am. Many would say this was peak Pan Am. They created a new tagline, the most experienced airline in the world. And this tagline actually rang true, since Pan Am had the most passenger flights, the biggest fleet with over 150 aircrafts flying to 86 countries around the world. While Pan Am was focused on international travel, TWA wanted to keep its market share in domestic flights. They did this by also ordering the new wide-body 747, but instead of using it only for international flights, they were the only ones flying it domestically. At this time, TWA was the only American airline to have a full fleet of jets, while other airlines such as Pan Am still were using some older turboprop engines for shorter flights. TWA soon became third in passengers by mile and eventually surpassed Pan Am in transatlantic flights. Both Pan Am and TWA were at their peaks between the end of 1950s through the early 1970s. They both were expanding their fleets, routes, and services to gain as much market share as possible. They were constantly trying to one-up each other on international and domestic air travel. Both Pan Am and TWA were hit hard by the 1970s oil crisis. During this time, US was having trouble getting enough oil. This made oil extremely expensive, and oftentimes there wasn't even enough for people to fill up their cars. Jet fuel was now 4 times more expensive, and the airlines had to raise ticket prices to try to break even on flights. This created a problem for both Pan Am and TWA, since they were heavily invested on the huge 747s. On every flight of the 747, the airlines would lose money based on the amount of fuel they consumed and the low number of passengers traveling at this time. Although Pan Am was hurt by the oil crisis since they had a lot of 747s for their international flights, TWA was positioned worse since they were overinvested on the 747. They ordered so many not because the demand was needed, but only to keep up with Pan Am's fleet. Also, to make matters worse, there was a flight attendant strike happening at the same time, which lasted around 6 weeks. To stay afloat, TWA started selling some of their planes at a deep discount. Other cost-cutting measures were implemented by both Pan Am and TWA, and they both survived to fly another day, but they were permanently scarred by this crisis. After the oil crisis ended, Pan Am was ready to gain its market share back. They tried to do this by merging with National Airline, but this merger ended up hurting Pan Am more than it helped. By 1980, they started selling off some of their assets to try to stabilize. Their most notable sale was for their lease for their Manhattan corporate office to Metropolitan Life for around $400 million. The iconic building is now known as the MetLife Building and showed that Pan Am was struggling. They also decided to sell their entire Pacific division, which was 25% of their total routes, to United Airlines for around $750 million. They tried to replace their older planes with more efficient new ones, which in the long term would be more profitable. However, Pan Am suffered a few small terrorist attacks at this time, and the Chernobyl disaster discouraged people from traveling. This made it difficult for Pan Am to regain its financial footing. The already struggling airline was hit by a disaster. In 1988, Pan Am Flight 103, a Boeing 747, was flying at 31,000 feet over Scotland when a bomb went off in the undercarriage of the plane. The bomb penetrated the fuselage, breaking the plane apart and scattering debris all over the town of Lockerbie. While 259 passengers and 11 people on the ground were killed, the US government found the airline guilty of willful misconduct and lacked security screenings. The FAA charged Pan Am with 19 accounts of security failures. A civil suit seeking $360 million for the families of those who died was also filed. After this disaster, Pan Am's reputation took a major blow. The struggling company started looking for a merger or a full buyout. In August 1990, another unforeseen event occurred with the start of the Gulf War. This completely destroyed passengers looking to fly internationally. With Pan Am focusing heavily on international routes, this would be the final blow for the iconic airline. With losses estimated at $3 million a day, the company just couldn't hold on, and on January 8, 1991, Pan Am filed for bankruptcy. Delta Airlines stepped in and purchased a majority of their still profitable assets. After the deal was done, Pan Am continued flying routes on a much smaller scale, but they continued to take on more losses. After 64 years of operation, on December 4, 1991, Pan American World officially ended all operation. Just like Pan Am, TWA was severely hurt by the oil crisis. Competition was also picking up on domestic routes. Companies such as Southwest were offering cheaper alternatives, and TWA was struggling to keep up. By the early 1980s, Carl Icahn stepped in and decided to buy the struggling airline. They were also getting Boeing's new 767 and began long-haul flights to keep up with the competition. They purchased other smaller airlines and made a heavy marketing push to increase passenger numbers. It seemed that this was actually working. Passengers, revenues, and profits started increasing. However, Carl Icahn decided to take the company private for his own personal gain. This increased TWA's debt by $4 billion and brought the company's net worth into the negative. They soon had to make cuts and gain cash quickly. This forced them to sell their London routes to American Airlines for around $450 million. This severely decreased their international market share from 20% down to 10%. In 1992, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. After reorganizing, Carl Icahn agreed to leave the company after making a substantial amount of money. TWA was still popular with consumers at this time, but this was not enough, and through the 90s, TWA could not regain profitability. In 1994 alone, the company lost $436 million, despite bringing in over $3.4 billion in revenue. The company re-entered Chapter 11 bankruptcy to try to get rid of some of its $1.7 billion of debt. Just like Pan Am though, disaster struck an already weak TWA. In 1996, Flight 800, a 747, from New York to Paris, exploded over the coast of Long Island, just 30 minutes after takeoff. All 230 on board were killed. The airline was criticized by how it responded and its aging fleet. After the disaster, their brand was permanently damaged. People became hesitant to fly with TWA. In April 2001, Trans World Airlines would file for their third and final bankruptcy. They would then be acquired by American Airlines, ending the 71-year-old airline. Both Pan Am and TWA have similar starts, flying mail for the US Post Office. They also have similar ends, with increased debts and major airline disasters tarnishing their reputations. In my opinion, TWA were mostly stricken with bad management, but with the passionate workforce and focus on customer experience, gained notoriety in the American airline industry. While I believe Pan Am was managed better, just bad timing and unforeseen events hurt the once iconic international brand. In the end, Pan Am and TWA were both at the forefront of American aviation and helped shape many of the practices that still exist today. Their fierce competition and rivalry was pushing the commercial aviation industry to a new standard. Perhaps though their rivalry hurt them more than it helped them, by taking on more debt and expanding too quickly just to try to keep up with each other. I just wanted to make this little aside and say I'm going to start a new Versus series, where we compare similar companies and go through how they got started, what similarities are between them, and what separates them from each other. If you have any suggestions on what you want to see next, leave a comment down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for the next video. Thanks for watching.